All right, just to give you a clue as to what's going on then. Today we're going to go over chapter 17, which it has some talk in there about functions, about the REST operator, the spread operator, modules, and also about ifs. If you don't know what those are, then you probably didn't read the chapter. So we'll go over those in just a couple minutes. All right, you'll see some of that in here. We're actually going to also look at probably one of the examples that's in the chapter as well. And then tomorrow we will go over chapter 18. All right, and that is on Ajax, and we're going to look at a bunch of examples. Now my hope is on Friday, because I'm writing a bunch of stuff right now, that Friday what we're going to do is we're going to literally run a lot of examples. All right, and I'll give you them, but at least with some of them I'll want you to type the stuff in, because I don't think by just copying stuff you're really getting the full effect. All right, so we're going to do, like I said, I will give you the files, but we will go and take a look at it. And that's going to take most, if not all, of the period. I don't know. All right. Then probably also by Friday, when you leave, I'm going to give you the test. Okay. Now, you don't have to work on it this weekend. No, you don't. When you come back on Tuesday, I'm going to give you the entire class period on Tuesday to work on it. Now, if you say, Aaron goes home and it's whenever, Friday, Saturday, Monday, whenever, and says, I'm just going to start on this, and boom, 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 he gets it all done, well, then he's got something else he can do then on Tuesday. All right? But I will see on Tuesday then exactly where people are. All right? But the point is, then what I want to do is I'm probably going to go in and maybe even take the rest of the week, like Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and have us go back and revisit MySQL and take a quick look at MongoDB, just so you've seen them both. And then in the following week, we'll start on Node, and we're immediately going to start with the database stuff too. All right, now what I did here was I went back on here. Yeah, it's W3 Schools. You're like, oh my God, not W3 Schools. Yeah, it's W3 Schools, and there's a lot of really good stuff in here. All right, and I'm going to go through, it's not very long, as you can see on the left. I want to go through the functions section that's in here. I will tell you the call you actually looked at when we did that prototype thing, we did a call in there. Apply is another way of doing call, but both apply and call are not used very often anymore if you're using the newer ES6 type of object-oriented JavaScript where you're actually creating classes. So the call and the apply become kind of moot. In other words, they're just not used very often. All right, so the first thing they mention here is the function declarations. And you all know this, but if you look at the example that's up there, or again, if you bring it up on your own machine, that is basically, what do they call that? I think that's just a function declaration. That's the old tried and true way of writing functions. All right. Now we're going to go into expressions and we'll look at arrow functions, etc. in just a couple minutes. But for years, that's the way people wrote every one of their functions. And it is not that you cannot write functions that way anymore. If you say to me, well, okay, then why do people use function expressions as opposed to function? Well, if you look at the example that's right there, all right, it's all on one line. Now, which is fine and dandy, but technically, you could have put all this on one line. All right? And all I can tell you is, if you're old school, you write things like this. If you're newer school, you're going to end up writing them like this. Now, that's not maybe a good reason or a good explanation, but really, as far as I can tell, at least, anything that you do with function expressions and arrow functions, you could have done with function declarations. The same stuff that you learned a year ago. All right? So what's kind of nice about this is they go through this function and they say, okay, notice it's not an executable statement. So as it said, it's not common to end it with a semicolon. You shouldn't end that with a semicolon. On the other hand, a function expression is an executable statement. All right, because what this does is, let's say that I passed in here 2 and 3. Okay, it returns 2 times 3, which is 6, but it actually stores the value in x. So since it is an executable statement, you put the semicolon on the end. All right, so this is, it says after a function expression has been stored in a variable, the variable can be used as a function. All right, so they show an example here that after you do this, notice it's a shortcut now. You see that? So they basically say, hey, x, after you do this, x now holds this. So notice it says let z equal, so that's the same thing as though you called this and you passed in 4 and 3. All right? So brevity is, I guess, what you get from this. And in both these cases, when you look at it up here and when you look at it here, they're both anonymous functions because neither one of them are named. Now, most of the time, people will tell you that if you're going to use anonymous functions like that, all right, so, something like this, for example, they're typically for a one-time shot. That if you are going to be using the function over and over and over again, by and large, what you should do is give it a name. All right, because that's the name you use when you invoke it. All right. Again, functions stored in variables do not need function names. In this case, doing it like this because we're putting it into a variable, I guess. They are always invoked or called using the variable name. And again, as you shown up above, must end with a semicolon. Now, that's even wrong because it says ends with a semicolon. It doesn't say must because remember that 99.9 times out of 100 in JavaScript, if you are supposed to put a semicolon in and you leave it off, they call it an implied semicolon where the system puts it in for you. All right. So let's see. It says functions can also be built with a built-in function constructor called function. I don't know if I've ever seen one done like this. I'm not going to say any more about it other than to say I don't know if I've ever seen anybody do one like this. There's nothing wrong with it, good, bad, or indifferent. One of the things that that happens here is you've got multiple ways of doing the same thing. All right, you pick the one that's the easiest for you. I will tell you that once we get into Node, virtually everything we're going to write is going to be using the arrow functions. All right. Now they talk about function hoisting here. We've talked a little bit about hoisting before. Notice what it says. It says it moves the declarations to the top of the current scope. Hoisting means applies to variable declarations and to function declarations. All right, it says because of this, JavaScript functions can be called before they're declared. So this is legal. You're calling it even though you haven't created it yet. That's not the way it is in all languages. In some languages, you must declare the function before you can call the function. So again, it just depends on the language. Now, there are a lot of books that will tell you, you'll see that recommend, they say even though you can do this, it's not considered a good practice to do it. All right? All right. The next thing is actually something that's right out of the chapter. These are called ifs. And an IFI means an immediately invocable function expression. And the thing that differentiates this from what we've seen before, you may or may not have noticed it, first of all, the whole function, everything, including the word function, has got parentheses around it. See that? And there are parentheses at the end, which means not only declare the function, but call it right away. So if you've got something that you want to declare and then call immediately, this is a way you can do it. Now, one thing about this, you might look at that and go, okay, that's fine. Why the heck would you ever even want to do this? All right? You don't ever have to do it. But what the author is saying is, again, this would be more like a one and done type of thing. You're declaring it, you're calling it. Boom, you're done with it. But you don't have to do it that way. All right. says JavaScript functions, we already saw an example of this, so there's nothing new there. They can be used in expressions, yes. Functions are objects. So as it says there, the type of operator returns function if you run it on a function itself. Functions have their own properties and methods. Notice here it says arguments.length returns the number of arguments received when the function is invoked. So this should return 2 because it has 2 arguments. All right. Now, arrow functions, like I said, you heard they were coming. So again, if you can't read this, it still seems, every time I look at this, I don't know if it's me or the machine, but it looks like there's not a great way to totally focus that. But arrow functions, as it says, allow for a shorter syntax. All right. So when you look at the 2 examples, as it says there, ES5 and ES6, so this is what we're moving toward. All right. So rather than writing it the top way, you write it the other way. You'll notice when you do that, typically you make it a const. And what does this say? Well, when you look, this constant is equal to this whole thing right here. You've got to read like this. Here's your parameters. Here's what you want to do with it. So you're passing in x and y, and it's x times y. Since the word return is not there, it is implied. So it is implied that you are returning x times y right there. All right? As it says, now there's a big section in the chapter, so I do want to go through this. Arrow functions do not have their own this. If you remember, we worked a little bit with the word this yesterday. There's probably 4 to 6 pages in this chapter on the word this. The word this has different meaning depending on where you try to use it. Sometimes if you try to use it in a certain way, the results are either unpredictable or probably won't give you what you expect. All right, and they will talk about that in the chapter, so I'll hold off on that until then. Arrow functions, it says, are not hoisted. So in other words, you have to define them before you can use them. All right, using const is safer than using var because a function expression is always a constant value. All right, it's also better technically than using let, which you technically can use var or let, but you shouldn't. All right, again, you can only omit the return statement and the curly brackets if you're putting it into a single statement. You could rewrite this right here. You could, after the arrow, sometimes you see this, all right, that there might even, there might be a parenthesis here or whatever, just a left paren, you hit enter, the stuff's on the next line, you hit enter again, then there's a right parenthesis, all right, and if you have that, you're typically also going to see a curly brace in here. And again, if you say, I don't know what you mean, you're going to see that starting when we get into the nodes section. All right. So again, this is one way you can rewrite it. There are a lot of different ways that you can rewrite this. Notice as it says here that these are not supported in IE 11 or earlier. All right. So the next thing is parameters. You know what parameters are. Books will differ. Some books will say that if I call a function called add2 and I pass in 7 and 8, okay, that those 2 numbers that I passed in, 7 and 8, are called arguments. But in the function that I'm declaring it, where it's expecting, so if I rename them A and B, that A and B, those are called parameters. See what I'm saying? Some books call them both parameters. Some books call them both arguments. Some reverse what I told you before. All right. The only thing they agree on is not to agree, evidently. All right. Now, you can have default parameters. And I told you something the other day that was true, but technically it is not true for JavaScript. All right. So when you look right here, it says function. This is the old way of doing it. So if you'd only passed in one parameter, it would have been x. And as it says here, if y is undefined, set it to 2. Now you can do it like this. And what I told you the other day that isn't true in JavaScript is In other programming languages, when you use default parameters like that, the default parameters must go on the end. In JavaScript, they don't have to. You can put them in their natural order. So if I've got X, Y, and Z, and X needs a default and Y and Z don't, I can still say X equal, comma, X equal, give it a value, comma, Y, Z. You can't do that. For example, you can't do that in C#. All right. As it says here, JavaScript functions have a built-in object called the argument object. Now, one of the things I'm hoping to do, because I thought about this today, I don't know if you guys remember this or not. Where is it? I think I've got it here still. Oh, it's on the other machine, so forget it. But I did a program for you, or we might have even done it together. I don't remember. I think we did it in C#, but we looked at it in JavaScript too, where we had that array and we got the min and the max and the average and the sum, etc. And we did all that stuff. I'm going to go back and redo that, all right, and redo it using all the stuff that we've learned right now. So like the rest operator, the spread operator, etc. Just so you can see that stuff, and it should really take the majority of the functions that I've written and cut them down from maybe an average of about 10 lines to probably an average of about 2 lines. All right. Arguments are passed by value, as it says there. What that means is if you pass a primitive, are you all comfortable with what a primitive is? A simple data value. So the JavaScript primitives are number, string, Boolean. There's a couple of other ones, but those are the ones you're going to use 99 times out of 100. Those are passed in by value, which means you're passing in a copy. All right, which means if you make a change to a copy, you're only changing the copy. You're not changing the, quote, real thing, unquote. On the other hand, if instead of passing in a primitive, you pass in an object, what you end up passing in, it's passed by reference, so you pass the address in. So any change that you make is a permanent change. That's the difference between passed by value and passed by reference. Usually they're called by value and called by reference. All right. Invoking a function, nothing new there. All right. Now, one thing about this, and I think you already do know this, but let's assume for just a second that, I don't know, let's say that up above this function, so up here, I put a new line in, right there. And I said, let product equal 0. Are you with me? So right here, I put in a line of code that says, let product equal 0. All right. Then in here, instead of saying return A times B, I say product equal A times B. Then I say return product. I'm asking you this question. Would that work? So in other words, let me just copy this. Hopefully I can. This isn't meant to trick you or anything. All right, but if I came through here and said, let product equal 0, then I did this. But instead of doing it like this, I come in and I say product equal A times B, and then I say return product. All right, and now I'll come in here and where they've got this, I'll say console.log my function, and we're passing in 10 and 2. Do you think that would work? It's not a trick. It really and truly isn't. All right? Why?
Because product is 0, so 0 can't equal A.
Right, it equals 0, but notice in here I'm setting it equal to this, and then that's what I'm returning. All right?
It would work, but that's not the way we should do it.
I agree with you. That wasn't the question, though. But you're right. You're right. And I think that it'll work, too. So let's see if it'll work. So I'm going to come over here. As we've been doing, I'm going to go to console, do my console.clear. paste that in, and hit enter. Looks like it worked to me.
So the reason I think it would work is because whenever we replace like our global constant, that's above everything else, and like kind of a hierarchy kind of sense.
Well, yes, much of what you just said right there is true. All right.
So
Now,
that product
but
is outside.
since product was defined outside, it's global, which means it's known program-wide. All right. But what you said, yes, you can do it like that. No, you shouldn't do it like that. Because I could come down here, right? Now, notice I've got all this, return product, etc. Okay? I could console log, and that's fine, but on the next line, I could say product equals 71. And then I could console product again. Console.log product. All right? And that actually should work as well. All right? So who cares? Well, the reason that that's important is what if you declare any variable or constant outside of a function, it's automatically global. And in that case, it's producing side effects. Now, it did give me the right answer here because I called it as part of a function. So that worked, all right? But I was able to take my return value and change it immediately. All right? This is a wanted side effect. The fact that I'm able to do this when I shouldn't, that's an unwanted side effect. All right? All right. And again, let's talk about this a little more. No pun intended. The this keyword. JavaScript uses the word this more than most other languages that have something like that do. You may or may not remember from the C# class, but one of the things that we had in there, if you remember almost day one in the C# class, I gave you a real simple method. It had an if statement in it, but it was a method to put in for your exit. So you click the button and it said, are you sure you want to exit? Okay? And it was yes or no. And if you clicked yes, it exited. If you clicked no, it didn't. Right? Well, to exit, the way we did it in there was we said application.exit, which is the recommended way of exiting. But another way that you can exit in there is to say me.close. Me is very much similar to what we are using here with this. All right? So it says there in JavaScript, the thing called this is the object that owns the current code. The value of this when used as a function is the object that owns the function. It says this is not a variable, and it's not. It's a keyword that you typically use along with variables. All right? So when a function is called without an owner, the value of this becomes the global object. The heck does that mean? All right? What that means is it says X will be the window object. So if you use this, it's like saying basically you're returning window. And window has got all sorts of stuff in it. Like when you do an alert, it's really a window.alert. When you do a prompt, it's really window.prompt. I mean, you can go out. I've never tried doing this, but I don't know why you couldn't. You should be able to go in here and inspect again. Go to console. We should be able to come in here. I wish there was a way to automatically clear that. It probably is. All right, but if we wanted to come in here, we should be able to do console.log and say window. And if I hit enter, that's all the stuff that's available to you in the window object. And it looks like they're numbered, so there's about 25 or 30 different things, more than that, I guess. Yeah, 29. different things that you can jack with. All right. It says in JavaScript you can define functions as object methods. Well, we kind of did this the other day. All right. This is more similar to the first way that we looked at when we were looking at the prototype stuff. I don't want to dwell on that, but they're just saying that you can do that. Invoking a function. Again, you can invoke it with a function constructor. We talked about that before. I've never seen that done. All right. Then there's the call, which we looked at yesterday. It says with a call method, you can write a method that can be used on different objects. If you remember, one of the things we did with call yesterday was we created a person object, and then we created the employee object. And the employee object did a call on the person object, all right, in order to get some of its information. All right. Apply, as they say in here, says you can write a method that can be used on different objects. It's similar. It's almost really identical to call. All right. Now, what I want to spend just a couple minutes on before we go into the chapter, because this is in your chapter, and that's closure. And that's one of the reasons I asked that question before about having the variable outside and having it be a global variable. The big thing about closure is what they end up doing is, and you can do this. I don't know if we've ever done this in class or not, but in JavaScript, and you can do this in many other languages, you can write a function inside of a function. If you write a function inside of a function, the one that's on the outside is typically called the outer function. The function on the inside is typically called the inner function. The big thing about a closure is the inner function, the inside one, has access to all the variables that were defined in the outer function. Even if the outer function is designed to run and then basically, okay, it's not running anymore. It's not, whatever. And that's the key thing about closures. All right. It basically, what it does is it's a scoping type of thing. And it allows different parts of a JavaScript program to use other parts of a JavaScript program. So as it says here, you know this, a function can access all variables defined inside of it. Yeah, that makes sense. All right. It says, but a function can also access variables defined outside of it. That's where I cheated and grabbed that example and showed it to you. All right. So it says in this last example, A is a global variable. In the first example, there it's a local variable. We've talked about scope before. There's really nothing new with that. All right. Now, really bad practice. This is another reason for having that using strict when I told you to use it. Notice this. If you declare a variable and you don't put var and you don't put let and you don't put const, it's automatically global. And that's what a lot of people do when they create their variables. In fact, they don't even declare them. They just, that's no declaration. That's just an initialization. And what it does behind the scenes is it declares it as a global variable. That's considered poor programming practice. You should never do that. Not that you can't, you just shouldn't. All right. Then this is going to explain closures. And I thought this did as good a job as just about anything I saw. Again, global variables live until the page is discarded. In other words, their life is the lifetime, typically, of the program. Local variables have shorter lives. They're created when the function is invoked. They're automatically deleted when the function is finished. And it's really, there's more stuff that happens behind the scenes with that. It's not important. All right, but once the function is finished, by default, they're not available anymore. All right. So this is this counter dilemma, and I've seen it like this in several books before. Okay. Suppose you want to use a variable for counting something, and you want this counter to be available to all functions. You could use a global variable and a function to increase the counter. So, let's see. We will call this. We will run it. Let's do it one more time and make sure if we add to this add one more time right? We run it, this should now be 4 then, if that works. And it is. So that all appeared to work. So let's take a look at the code here. We don't really care about the HTML. I just care about the JavaScript that you see on the screen right now. So we create this variable that's called counter. You can see that it's global. All right? That's actually important right here. And it's important because since it's declared outside of the function, when we run it the first time and we say counter plus equal 1, it's what you think it would be. It's 1. But when we come in there the next time, we're adding 1 to 1. So since we're calling it 4 times, its value is 4. Now, I'm not even going to ask because that should just make sense to everybody. All right? But let's keep following this. It says there is a problem with the solution above. This is kind of what I tried to show you before. Any code on the page can change the counter without calling add. And that is true. All right? So it says the counter should be local to add to prevent other code from changing it. All right? So now look. If you take a look at the example that's right here, and it doesn't matter, it's 0 as you can see, and I can call this again like that. I can put it in a bunch of times. I got it in there 7 or 8 times. And still, when I run it, it's 0. And the reason that it's 0 is even though I've got a global variable here named counter, and I've got a local variable here named counter, the local variable does what's called, it shadows the global one. So as far as the system is concerned, that global one that's up on top there doesn't even exist. And since we are coming in every time, and we are setting counter here to 0, all right, it's getting reset every single time to 0. So that's why it's going to tell you that the result is 0. All right. So it says it did not work because we display, it says the global counter instead of the local counter. All right. So even though the one that we're working with is the local one, the global one is the one that's getting displayed, the one that we're not manipulating. And since that was set to 0 up above, it's 0. In fact, I didn't try this, but what if we came in here and said let counter equal, let's just give the value. I'll put in here 37, all right, and run. All right. Now I would have thought, whoops, it's the wrong one, I'm sorry. That one. Let's make that 37 and see if we get 37 for the result right here. You can see we do. So even though we're using a local variable in here, it doesn't care because it's grabbing that value that's right there. And virtually any language that I know of allows you to do something like that, in that you can create a local variable that has the same name as a global variable. That's poor practice, but you can do it. In fact, I don't even know of any language that if you do that is going to actually complain or give you a warning. I don't think they do. All right. Here. All right. A JavaScript inner function can solve this. Now you'll have to look at this because this is one of those things that's kind of hard to wrap your head around. Some of you will just get it like that, all right, and some won't. I'm worried towards the ones that won't. Typically, when we get stuff like this, I can get it, but oh, okay, all right, yeah, I guess it makes sense. All right. So I'm going to actually grab this one. In fact, I copy it here, so I'm going to put it in here, and there it is. It doesn't matter. I'm just going to grab it right here. Okay. So let me copy. I don't know. The reason I'm showing you this is what I'm about to show you may help. I don't know. So let me comment this all out. The whole thing. And then I'm going to come back in here again. I'm going to put a little spacing in here. There it is. But what I'm going to do is really space it out. All right. This is what's happening. Throwing everything together like that, I don't know if it makes it easier or harder to understand. All right, so what are we doing? So we're coming in here, we've got this function that's called add. So it comes in here and it creates this variable called counter. It sets it equal to 0. Now, this doesn't do anything right there, nothing. So it comes down to here and says call plus. So it takes that thing that was 0 and it adds 1 to it. So its value is now 1. And then it returns it. Okay? That's why we get there 1. Again, I'm not asking. I'm just telling you that's kind of the way I looked at it. To me, it made a little more sense like that. All right? But you can look at the difference between these two when you scrunch everything together. Sometimes people do that for brevity when you look at what so I put it out into more lines, but to me, laying it out like that just made more sense. All right, so moving on with this. It says this could have solved the counter dilemma if we could reach the plus function from the outside. All right, but we can only call that from in here because it's an inner function. Does that make sense? Because it's a function that's been defined inside of a function. So it's not available out here. In fact, I believe that if we went in here and did this, if I grab this line that says plus, right there, and I'm going to remove it for now, all right, and I'm going to try to call it from outside, all right, and I'm going to run. It says 0, this doesn't, but there is an error that's coming up. I don't know if it catches it. Actually, we have to go into the console to check. But this is not permissible because this function that it's calling is inside of another function. All right? I don't know if I'm making it easier or harder for you to understand. So, it says this could have solved it again if we could reach it, but we can't. What we need to do is we need to find a way to execute counter equals 0 only once. We need what's called a closure. All right? So it says, remember self-invoking functions. So notice right here, see this? We have now made this function right here, this whole thing starts there, ends there. It's now an IFI, an immediately invocable function expression. All right? And we're telling it to call it right away, too. Okay? So it calls it, and it calls it, and it calls it. All right? So this, what happens when you call add is it's going to basically call this function. So what is it doing? It's returning counter plus 1. All right? Since we're doing this 3 times, it's returning 3. Now, that may have been as clear as mud, so let's look at the explanation for this. It says there the variable add is assigned to the return value. All right, it's assigned to the return value of the IFI, the self-invoking function. The self-invoking function runs only once. It sets the counter to 0 and it returns a function expression. So add, for lack of better words, becomes your function now. And as they mentioned, the wonderful part of it is we are calling this inner function right here. We are calling from outside. All right, and it works because this is being called once, and then when it runs through this, basically what it's saying is, okay, from now on, when you call add, you're basically referring to this. All right. So as it says, this is called the JavaScript Closure. It makes it possible for a function to have, what in essence are private variables. All right. So I don't know if it paid to go through that or not, but that's the way I decided to attack this. All right. So we're in section 4, and as it says here, the first 3 sections of the book presented all the essential JavaScript skills you needed for client side. All right, it says now section 4 presents skills that'll take you to the next level. So first, as it says there, we're going to talk about functions and closures and modules. All right, and it says in chapter 18, we will build asynchronous JavaScript applications. This is good because when you learn asynchronous JavaScript on the client side, you're going to use the same type of methods. Methods isn't the right word there, but the same type of protocol, whatever, when you do it on the server side as when we will learn it on the client side. All right? And then again, chapter 19 is an intro to Node.js. All right. Now, just so I can split these, I'm going to split